listening to this, they're probably thinking those are the people who sit and they meditate all the time. Um,
Yeah.
but there are differing opinions on that now from looking at a lot of the texts as
Right.
to whether or
Right.
not that's true. Could you give your position on that, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's a fact that Zen masters meditated. Um, I don't think that that's controversial. Um, I think there's maybe some differences on what meditation meant for certain people, certain groups of people. Um, like, for example, there's a difference in the way. I mean, if people like, I can't remember his last name, Bielefeld, or do you know what I'm talking
Uh,
about?
Carl Bielefeld.
Yes, that's right. Um, he's a scholar specifically of Dogen, who is a Japanese monk and credited with the founding of the Soto Zen school. Um, so, is it Bielefeld or Bielefeld? Is there an L there? Maybe I should
There's
have
an
Googled
L. I don't know if I've ever heard it said out loud. I've always said Bielefeld in my head, but I don't know.
it. Mr. B.
Okay, yeah.
um, anyways, he wrote this book on Dogen's meditation manual, the Fukan Zazengi. Um, and in that book, he makes a really interesting claim, which is that meditation for Dogen is transformed relative to what meditation was for the Chan masters in China that he took the practice from. And Mr. B sort of claims that there's like a metaphysical element to Dogen's view of meditation. And that difference was kind of a shift that occurred into the Soto Japanese Zen school in comparison to the Chan school. Now,
So that
this is
like meditation has a metaphysical um implication to it. Is that what
yeah,
you were saying?
exactly. So
Okay.
like Mr. B's argument is that when someone sits like a Buddha, they become a Buddha. And Dogen, uses a very simple language like that, where, like if it's good enough for Bodhidharma, why aren't we doing it? Right. If Bodhidharma is doing this is something that we should.
Bodhidharma is the first Zen master, is
Yeah.
the easy way to explain it for the audience. Legendary founder of Zen in China who sat in a cave for 9 years facing the wall. That's what the story goes. He sat so long his legs rotted off. So
Yeah.
Dogen's taking that example of how we should behave.
Yeah, exactly. And for Dogen, when you sit like Bodhidharma, you become like Bodhidharma. Um, and now this is one scholar's work, and he's the only scholar I've seen really make a claim about those kinds of differences between the practice there. So, I encourage people to research that if that's something they want to learn about. It makes sense to me just based on my reading of translations of these texts when I compare like what Huang Bo says about meditation. Huang Bo is a Chinese master, much older than Dogen, and
Like
not that,
hundreds of years older, I think. Yeah,
yeah,
not that much in the grand scheme of things, but like old enough to where several generations in between him and Dogen. And
right,
he's
right.
Huangbo's like right at the beginning of like the golden age of Chinese Zen.
Mhm.
But wait, I have to interrupt though and ask you.
Sure.
So, what would it mean? What is the sort of like non-metaphysical interpretation of meditation, or would you even say that there's a non-metaphysical bent in Zen or Chinese Chan before Japanese Zen?
Um, I think so.
Okay.
It's hard to explain why I think so, but my
Well, oh, sorry. I was just going to interject. Like one of the things you were saying earlier that to lend credence to your argument, maybe before you elaborate, just really quick. I mean, if you look at translations, you could translate, the story. Like, there's a story where a master, um, he he's always holding up one finger to answer any question. One day he catches an attendant, like a sort of lesser monk, replicating his teaching technique, answering with one finger, and he leaps out of the bushes and chops off the attendant's finger. And then the master shows him, he then lifts one finger to the attendant after having done this, and the attendant has a realization, from what I remember. Now, you could translate that after the fact of like he experienced a profound enlightenment or something like that, right? Or but if you just take it on the face value, he had a realization. People have realizations all the time, right? So it could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a realization of some sort of like ontological or supernatural or transcendent truth. And I think there are like examples like that throughout the canon where the way they were interpreted in later times does not necessarily mean that that's the way they were intended to be interpreted. But sorry, I want to hear your explanation as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's in line with sort of how I think about it. Like one thing people can understand or grasp is this idea of like that which you experience is not necessarily evidence for what you experience being true. Like for example, we can see what are they called when you're in the desert? A mirage. You can see a mirage, right? But that doesn't mean that there's the oasis over the sand dune. You see the mirage. And I think that, let's say you have a meditation practice, and in that meditation practice, you have an experience. From that experience, it can be viewed as simply an experience, or it can be viewed as evidence for some truth out there. And I think when it's the difference between like saying there's a metaphysical aspect to it is to take an experience you have as evidence for some truth out there, versus really just kind of viewing it as like content that you were there for.
Right. We're all content creators, even when we're meditating. It's just, you don't pick the content when you meditate. Usually.
And so, you asked about meditation practice a while ago. I think that I personally meditate. I sit down, I stare at a wall. If you meditate with the intention of having a certain experience to verify a kind of conclusion, I think that is a really different kind of meditation than what the Zen masters were talking about, which to me is more like an exercise or a physical fitness that they participated in as a community. Really kind of just like playing with that direct experience thing. At least that's how I kind of view it. Not that like meditation will give you a goal of enlightenment or something like that, but more like, meditation is a place where you can let content come and go, and what happens.
So I guess I would be remiss if I didn't give, because this was the side, I haven't thought about arguments like this in a long time, but this is the side I would have been on back in the days of the Zen forum. The
Zen War.
but yeah, the great Zen Wars. But like, I'd be remiss if I didn't give some sort of like steel man of the Dogen position, kind of in response to what you said, which I think, well, I think first to sort of tease out the issue for the listeners, maybe this is the defense I'll mount and see maybe what your reaction to it is. The way I would look at it is in terms of there's like sort of some sort of problem or underlying contradiction. A Hegelian might say there was a dialectical movement going on, I think, in the Chan or Zen movement. And I think Dogen thought he was solving that. And what that issue was that I think it's contained in actually what the description you just gave, which maybe some people in the audience have picked up on, that there's this sort of like, we'll say apparently two-sided or two faces to Zen, or two, and I say apparently because, in the Zen text, they would say, no, that's just your delusion speaking. But on the one hand, right, we're doing these practices in order to, have maybe bring our attention more directly to our direct experience. And there's also this idea that there's this enlightenment realization that's possible. But then on the other hand, you can't start meditating with this conclusion that I'm going to bring about this enlightenment experience, because that's counterproductive in and of itself. And secondly, on the other hand, on the other side of that coin, you'll see many dialogues where Zen masters say there's absolutely no difference between ordinary people and enlightened people. And so there's sort of this contradiction, or at least apparent contradiction between, okay, there's this direct experience that's really valuable. There's this enlightenment experience that's really valuable, but it's also not valuable. And it also isn't really any different. And it's not something we should attach to, right? We shouldn't indulge in the stench of that. And I think so Dogen's innovation, from the way I understand it, was more or less the reason why he says, when you sit like a Buddha, you are a Buddha, was his sort of fix, or his little trick, his dialectical trick is, when you practice, you've already attained it. And so in that moment, you are already done. And so what would be your reaction to that, I guess? Because it's a unification of this is the need to practice, but also in practicing, it's not like a linear goal that you're building up to. You're done just by doing it, which is kind of paradoxical in and of itself, I guess.
Totally. I mean, I 100% agree with you that Dogen's innovation was to solve that what looks like a paradox or contradiction. I absolutely think that's what his whole quest of going to China was about, and coming back and starting to write about these things. I think that was a big question in his life. So I totally agree there. As far as when you sit, that is the attainment. I think that as a dialectical move, I think it's somewhat brilliant. And it does speak to kind of the power of what he said, that people today still resonate with that. So as far as, okay, what's the difference between what Dogen said there and then what other Zen masters said about meditation practices? There's a very famous poem by the sixth patriarch. Maybe I should unpack a little bit of what a patriarch is in Zen. But the sixth patriarch is the last patriarch, when he said there are no more patriarchs after him. But he has this poem where he talks about polishing a mirror, saying well, there's nothing to gain dust, so there's no reason to polish it. And polishing a mirror used to be a metaphor for one of the benefits you get from a meditative practice. In Buddhism and in Taoism, that same metaphor was used in Taoism too, of polishing the mirror. And Huineng, the sixth patriarch, takes that analogy and he sort of says well, there's nothing there to polish. And that's sort of what Dogen might be saying, right? Your argument, your steel man, is that Dogen is saying, when you sit like a Buddha, then you're not polishing. I think, if that's the case, if that is where Dogen is going, I don't really see much disagreement ultimately. I think there might be an argument about okay, well, which one is more effective at helping people realize that? But as far as deep down, what are they really saying? It could be that they're in agreement and it's really just verbal disagreement that we're quibbling about at the end of the day.
Well, and the other issue too would be, just to zoom out, I think that the issue that I think many people who are, and I don't know what I would call this exactly, because there's sort of a movement that I've only seen online, but I know it exists. A lot on the Zen subreddit, but kind of elsewhere, of what we might just call secular Zen broadly, Zen that's not married to any sort of Buddhist institutional tradition. And that seems to be the movement that is going to reject Dogen. And
Mhm.
I always I can't help but wonder if really their issue is with how people sort of took what Dogen said and created this cult of sitting, and that you know that it becomes this obsession almost, and it's like a self-help obsession that people are using. That's almost become like a crutch for many people. And I do think that if Dogen was alive, he'd probably be like horrified, at least to some extent. But
Yeah, yeah, probably. It's a fascinating question about this secular Zen versus the religious Zen. I think there are problems with both. The mistake of secular Zen is that they abandon community and they abandon the ethics from a community, which, if there's going to be any kind of practice, I think a community and an ethics is going to be extremely helpful. In terms of understanding what you're experiencing, but also kind of providing some rails, right? Like, it's very easy to take experiences you have, and even with the greatest intention and effort, come to nihilistic conclusions about there's no meaning, everything's virtual, I'm trapped in the matrix, that kind of, you can go down a dark road. And I think that's one of the benefits of community that can be provided. On the other hand, the more religious communities abuse that power, maybe accidentally. It might not be intentional, but we see it emerge a lot, where you can be excluded from the community if you don't have certain beliefs, and maybe those beliefs are really just something that came out of the community. So there are sort of risks coming out of both sides. And I think Dogen would rightly criticize both of those tendencies from each of them.
yeah, it's interesting. I don't. It's very strange because I mean, and if we get too deep into this topic, I could derail this whole conversation. But the whole just psychology of like the Western mind and what it's like looking for in Zen or Zen Buddhism or Soto is very fascinating to me, because it's almost as if I mean, this is where I could bring in Nietzsche, right? And the death of God, the decline of religiosity in the West. It seems apparent to me that Buddhism, and I mean, Zen is one of the more popular forms, has been very attractive to people who are looking for something to fill that void. And I think that can be
Right.
a really dangerous situation in some sense, because I mean, we see it all the time with small religious communities that are untethered to like any broader institutional structure. I think those are almost the most dangerous, because that's where you get like charisma, basically,
Yeah.
running things. And
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And we could have a whole podcast on just sort of like, but we could have an entire podcast on like the McDonaldification of Zen in the
yeah,
corporate worlds, and how it just maintains corporate power structures, and the what's the word I'm looking for, the emphasis on productivity, right? You meditate to be more productive at work. Like, that's totally missing the point. And then,
right.
there's this other element of
Have you heard of the Amazon booths at Amazon?
oh my God, are you kidding me?
No, that's
No, I
literally what
have
they're
not.
calling that initiative. Like it's like a little quiet booth you can go into for like 10 minutes and have your
Holy,
yeah.
that's fucked
Uh
up. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
yeah, yeah, of course. Of
That
course.
is that's fucked up. That's my feeling about that.
Thank you for listening to that clip from the Nietzsche podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like what you hear. It really helps the channel out. And I post full episodes from the podcast here, as well as a lot of other content. You can also check it out on Spotify and Anchor.